Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
At one time, it was lavatory assemblies. Now it's soap dispensers. But the Defense Department seems to have a proclivity for adding military specifications to otherwise commercial items. My next guest says it's time for a snap to back to commercial item preference. Federal sales and marketing consultant Larry Allen joins me now, and this discovery is based on a recent DoD IG report that does sound like some of those reports coming out in the 1980s.
Yeah, Tom, this one really made me think back to the days of parachute pants and members-only jackets. We have the Department of Defense taking, this time Boeing to task for overcharging for a soap dispenser, something like 80 times what a commercial soap dispenser would cost. But predictably, Boeing shot back saying, look, it's not the same soap dispenser. There's an actual military specification or mil-spec for this soap dispenser. So it may look like the soap dispenser you get at Target or wherever, but it has its own features. And that got me thinking, Tom, just lately I've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence from contractors saying, you know, the government says it wants commercial, but by the time it ends up getting the solution it really wants, sometimes it looks a little bit like commercial. Sometimes it doesn't really look very much like its commercial counterpart at all. And, you know, that's not just to dun the government, Tom. I think both sides like that specialization because with the specialization comes potentially more money and reduced competition. But we're getting away from the commercial item preference that we've had for almost all of the last 30 years, one that served the government well. And that's what I'm writing about. I think it's time for us to take a time out and look back to see what the benefits were of this before we go back to where we were in the 80s where the vice president has to go on TV and talk about the number of shards of glass that a ashtray can break into.
Yes, I remember that one. That was the National Partnership for the Reinvention of Government and the famous ashtray specification. But is there anything industry can do if, say, for a soap dispenser, I guess this is aboard an aircraft, and commercial aircraft and I presume military aircraft are pressurized nowadays, so whatever works on, United Airlines is going to work on a C-17. Can't industry say, you don't have to do it this way?
Well, in fact, I think industry should go back at least once to its government customer and say, we don't think you need this. Let me show you what you can get for much, much less that is going to fulfill, well over 95% of your needs, particularly in the case of a soap dispenser. But you go beyond that and you look at things like commercial software, where there's a tendency on both the government and contractors' part to add specialized features to that software. Maybe you have a slightly different supply chain for the one that goes to the government than you do for your commercial one. Both sides like that specialization. Everybody likes to think that their mission is different from the other person's and that they need something slightly different from what the Army has. If you're in the Navy and if you're in the Air Force, you think that the Navy standard doesn't quite measure up to yours. And the result is we get these things that may look like a commercial item and start off as a commercial item, but they end up not really being commercial. And it's difficult for industry to be the policeman because they want to be responsive to their government customer. However, I do think industry has a role in saying, hey, wait, this is not necessarily the best use of budgets. Let's find a way to make the commercial solution work so that we're saving everybody some money here and conducting a faster acquisition.
And in commercial items, though, is there also the possibility that the government defaults to its own specs because some subcomponent might come from a prohibited nation? Just to get back to the soap dispenser idea, it could be assembled, in Abilene, Kansas or something, but the spring that makes the plunger pop back could be from China, or the plunger assembly. I'm just making this up. But could that be part of the reason sometimes?
Oh, I definitely think so, Tom. I think, we found this. And, of course, we're using soap dispensers as kind of a straw man. But when you start getting into technology and software and hardware and, sensitive solutions, this is absolutely an issue that increasingly comes into play. We have things like Section 889A and B rules. We have a semiconductor rule that would limit the sources of semiconductors making its way through the regulatory process right now. We have CMMC that talks about cybersecurity requirements, even for commercial item suppliers. So you can see just right there are three things that are front page right now that really cause the government to change up the commercial item and requires contractors to make tweaks to it as well.
We're speaking with Larry Allen, president of Allen Federal Business Partners, and you're also writing this week about the Small Business Administration has got a proposal to have the rule of two on IDIQ contracts, which is kind of breaking new ground.
Breaking new ground is probably the least of it, Tom, but yes, this could be a rule that has a very substantial impact on the usability and efficacy of multiple award, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts, MAIDIQs. Sometimes we call those GWACs. That's a subset of those. But this is the general type of contract we're talking about. And what the SBA is saying is that unless an exception applies, if you have two or more small businesses on that contract vehicle that are capable of meeting the government's needs, you're going to have to set that aside for small businesses, just as you would if it were an open market order. But one of the key differences, Tom, is that in the open market, you have the rule of two applies only to purchases up to the simplified acquisition threshold, or $250,000. We don't have that in this proposed rule. There's a lot in this proposed rule to look at. On the surface, you may think, well, what's wrong with giving small businesses more exposure to government market? Well, I'm all in favor of that. But if you think about it just a little bit, you have to say, well, wait a minute. This rule could actually end up hurting more small businesses than it helps if it takes away opportunities from the vast majority of small firms that do business as subcontractors. So I think this is something that's going to have some careful scrutiny.
And what about those IDIQs where the whole thing is set aside for small business?
Well, that's an interesting point. On the surface, you think, well, wow, that's really great. We're even going to trump this up more. But in reality, if you've got open acquisition programs that are now more or less on the same footing as a small business IDIQ, the investment you as a small business made in obtaining that IDIQ potentially could go down. It could go down a little, or it could go down a lot, depending on how government customers want to buy. So you spent a lot of R&D money, a lot of bid and proposal money to get on this small business contract vehicle, and now it's not as special as you thought it was going to be. That not only hurts your ability to do business, but it potentially hurts the valuation of your small business overall if you're seeking to sell it.
Right. So what is your opinion of what people should say then? Because there is a deadline to comment on this rule, which is Christmas Eve, of course.
Of course. Just coming down, the FAR Council's coming down the chimney, right along with Santa. There's a graphic for you. But I think that there ought to be a compromise here somewhere, Tom. I think, if you're applying the rule of two in the open market up to a certain dollar threshold, and you really want to apply the rule of two here, make it consistent. So, if you've got a cap it somewhere. Don't make it open-ended so that you're taking away the opportunities for small business subcontractors to do work through large business primes in all situations. Also, don't get the government into a situation where the default is to award even a large task order to a small business, and then we've got some performance issues. That serves neither the government nor the small business well. So I think we have to think this one through and see if there's some compromise language that we might be able to arrive at.
And this all comes in the context of the possibility of the simplified acquisition threshold itself going up substantially.
Right. And you look at it, there are bills in both the House and Senate that would raise the simplified acquisition threshold, something, generally speaking, I'm in favor of. We haven't seen that raised, Tom, since the mid-1990s. A lot of water under the bridge since then. It's probably time to look at increasing the simplified acquisition threshold overall.
Larry Allen is president of Allen Federal Business Partners. As always, thanks so much.
Tom, thank you, and I wish your listeners happy selling.
And we'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.